Ambassador John Bolton, welcome to the Dispatch Podcast.
Glad to be with you.
Mr. Ambassador, we've talked many times over the years. This is an interesting moment to chat. Let's just begin broadly. We're a little over 2 months into the Trump administration. What do you make of it so far?
Well, I think in the national security field, a lot of damage has been done in the political area, in the international military area, in the business and trade area. The steps that Trump has taken in a very short period of time has ripped through decades of effort to build up. It's none of it is irreversible, but a lot of damage has been caused, and we could go through it kind of detail by detail. But the net effect here is a substantial loss of American prestige and ability to protect its own interests, drifting far away from Reagan's model of the U.S. role in the world, where we have a strong position that benefits us and benefits our allies. We seem to be determined to lose the allies and try and pick up with our adversaries. And I think, although we haven't seen the full effect of the trade war that's coming, that will simply amplify all of the problems that are now being created. So there's a lot of work to do for the next 46 months to mitigate this damage so that the rebuilding and repair work afterward is as limited as we can make it. But it's going to be a difficult challenge. There's no question about it.
Well, I want to get into some of the details as you said we could, and at the end ask you, as you said, how it could be reversed, some of these things. As we speak, they may have already landed. We're speaking on Friday. J.D. Vance and his wife will be landing in Greenland. Is Greenland important to America's, is strategically important to America? And if so, is this the right way to go about trying to acquire it?
Well, Greenland is strategically and economically important to the United States. It was in 2019 when Trump was first given this idea by a friend of his. And there are a lot of different ways we could proceed to help make our interests safer, more secure against Russian and Chinese threats that are growing more acute as the polar ice melts and sea routes around Greenland become more feasible, and the attractiveness of the mineral wealth on Greenland becomes more interesting to China and Russia. America has been interested in Greenland for a long time. During 2019, we did a lot of research on this to get ready for what Trump might have in mind. You know, the first effort of the United States to purchase Greenland was 1868 by William Seward, having bought Alaska from Russia the year before. And there's a long history since then. So yes, indeed, there's an enormous strategic interest for us here. Didn't originate with Trump in 2019 or earlier this year. There's also a way to go about it. And one way not to go about it is to slap your Democratic allies like Denmark in the face, push their elected leaders into a corner where it's hard to make a deal, and treat the Greenlanders as if they're living in an amusement park that Americans go and visit and say, my goodness, look at the natives. That doesn't facilitate the objectives that Trump says he wants. There are ways to do this. I think it's feasible. I think we can negotiate with Denmark. We can negotiate with the Greenlanders, not in Yankee Stadium under the spotlights, but behind closed doors to achieve the results we want. I'm not sure that Trump cares about any of that. To him, it's just another real estate deal. It's like a plot of land on Park Avenue and 57th.
He hasn't ruled out, I don't know if he would, using military force to take Greenland. We had former Prime Minister Boris Johnson on the podcast earlier this year. He didn't think it was likely, but he said that if the U.S. did something like that, they would have to invoke Article 5 of NATO, because that would be an attack on NATO by another NATO member. Is it possible that Trump would use military force to get Greenland if he couldn't come to some sort of deal with Denmark?
I think it would be proof he was insane. It's just incomprehensible to me that we're even talking about this and saying, well, he hasn't ruled the use of force out on Greenland, Panama, Canada. I don't know. How about the Gaza Strip? This was the guy who wanted to end endless wars. It shows the utter inconsistency of his thinking, the lack of any coherent philosophy or national security strategy. This is, as it was in the first term, about the whims of Donald Trump.
You warned that you thought that if Donald Trump was reelected, he would pull out of NATO. Um, are you any less concerned about that now? Is he laying the groundwork to have a pretext to do that by creating these problems with Denmark, creating the divide between Europe and the United States with Ukraine? Are these pretexts that he could use to pull out of NATO?
Well, it's possible they could be used as pretext. I don't think he needs many more reasons. I think in his own mind, he believes that we defend Europe, we don't get anything out of it, and they don't pay for it. Now, if that's the way NATO worked, I'd probably agree with him, but that's not the way NATO works. It doesn't take into account the advantages we get from the NATO alliance. But I think it's also important here, and I've been trying to say this to our European friends, they need not to overreact to Trump. So when the incoming chancellor of Germany says Germany wants independence from the United States, when Kaja Kallas, the European Union foreign affairs spokesperson, says the West needs a new leader, when Trump hears that, that is practically a permission slip for him to withdraw from NATO, to say, well, if the Europeans don't want us, that's fine. We'll withdraw. You know, during the Cold War, one of the principal objectives of the Soviet Union was to split the Western alliance, and they failed. And that's one reason they lost the Cold War. We're splitting the alliance ourselves right now.
If Donald Trump won't take using military force off the table for Greenland, does it weaken, or do we have the credibility to make the argument to China not to take Taiwan by force? Does it weaken our argument against some bad actors, truly bad actors, if we are opening the possibility of taking territory by force?
Sure. I mean, I think it justifies what they're saying. Trump said on Thursday night that Greenland was necessary for our national security. Well, that's Putin's argument for Ukraine. It's China's argument for Taiwan. And, you know, it's another reflection of Trump's affinity for the authoritarian leaders. That's the way they behave. And so now that's the way he's behaving. It's fun to be a big guy like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. I don't think that's what the American people voted for in 2024. I don't think it's even remotely close to what they thought they were getting.
Well, I mean, more particularly on China. I mean, you wrote about Donald Trump's interactions with Xi in your book. Do you think that he would come to a deal with China over Taiwan? And if so, what would that look like?
Well, there are certainly a lot of concerns in Taiwan about that you know, Trump would like nothing better than at some point to have what he fondly called during the first term the biggest trade deal in history between the U.S. and China, where, you know, if we could get China to correct a lot of its behavior in the international economic arena, stealing our intellectual property, just as one good example, maybe you could get a big trade deal. But Trump wants a big trade deal because he would be the center of attention. And I think he would give up a lot, maybe including Taiwan, to get it. He said during the campaign he thought that Taiwan stole the U.S. semiconductor chip manufacturing industry. And that's not true. He later backed off that. But that's the kind of thing that's Chinese propaganda, and yet he repeats it as though it's received wisdom. So it's a very dangerous time for the United States, because we've got a president who, not only with respect to China but with respect to Russia on Ukraine, often trusts the leader of our adversary more than he does our intelligence community or our close allies.
Well, explain that to us. Explain that to the listener. Why does Trump seem to attack our allies, Canada, you know, even if he disagrees with, you know, the leader of Canada, more harshly than he attacks, you know, genuinely evil people like Vladimir Putin?
You know, Trump thinks that international affairs are really matters of personal relations. He thinks if he has a friendly relation with Vladimir Putin, then the U.S. has good relations with Russia. And the converse is true. If he has bad relations with Volodymyr Zelensky, then we have bad relations with Ukraine, which unfortunately is what things look like at the moment. I can't explain it psychologically, but I think looking at Putin or Xi or Kim Jong-un, with whom Trump said in the first term, he said, we fell in love. That's not how they regard it. They think Trump is an easy mark, but They're big guys, and in their country, they do what big guys do, meaning they're not constrained by courts or legislatures. And I think he's envious, and he wants to be a big guy like them. So Panama, Greenland, whatever comes up on the radar screen, is something that he can play with as if he were Vladimir Putin.
The way that some people around Trump explain it is that he believes that he has to say these things in order to negotiate with Vladimir Putin. Is Vladimir Putin more likely to give up on something that he considers important to him because Donald Trump says nice, flattering words about him?
No, I don't think Trump has the slightest awareness that Putin in particular is manipulating him in the ways of an old experienced KGB agent. You can see it in operation, but I don't think Trump sees it. So, for example, in the 2024 campaign, Trump said repeatedly there would have been no Russian invasion of Ukraine if he had been president. Now, that may or may not be, it's an unprovable statement one way or the other. But after the inauguration, Putin said in Moscow, I don't disagree with President Trump. If he had been president, there wouldn't have been a war in Ukraine. So Trump was just very happy to hear that because it showed that Putin was validating the point he had made in the campaign. And what Putin knows for sure is he's now rung Trump's bell and gotten a very happy response. And that was just the beginning of the manipulation. Then they released Mark Foley, a longtime American hostage in Moscow. That pleased Trump. Lukashenko of Belarus then released another American prisoner. That made Trump happy. This is how Putin plays it. I'm not saying he's always right. I'm not saying Putin doesn't make mistakes too. But by and large, in that relationship, the one who's getting what he wants is Putin.
What is the president referring to? He always says that when he says what you said, that that Putin never invaded any country on his watch, that he told Vladimir Putin in some meeting that what the consequences would be if he invaded Ukraine, and Trump never details exactly what he told him, but he said Putin got the point. Do you know what he's referring to? What meeting he's referring to?
No, and I can't obviously say definitively about meetings that occurred certainly after I left the administration, but I don't think it occurred from the time of his first inauguration, at least until the time I left. I think the more likely explanation is he made the conversation up. He made it up, and he does this from time to time about exchanges he wished had taken place. And he always wins these conversations. He's always the one who prevails. Funny thing about that. You can tell in many cases when he talks about conversations with other Americans or people who work for him, they always start off by saying, well, Mr. X said to me, sir, we need to do X. That's not the way it works. That's the way Trump likes it to think it works. But making up things really out of whole cloth that cannot be proven or disproven is something Trump does all the time.
The tariffs. Do you think these are I mean, this is the constant debate on CNBC these days. Are they a negotiating tool, or do you think that they will remain by and large at very high levels?
Well, in a sense, everything Trump does is negotiation. Since he has no philosophy, everything is a potential transaction, which is also another way of saying he doesn't believe in anything. Everything he's got is for sale. But on some things, and I think tariffs are a good example, these are things he has believed in for a long time, not part of any coherent philosophy, but just he likes them. He can inflict them on foreign states without congressional approval. At least that's his legal argument. We'll see if that gets challenged. He can make them 20% one day, 60% the next day, 10% the next day. He likes that. It shows just how much control he's got. He sees it as a way to raise revenue. He thinks he's taking money away from foreigners, which is a demonstration he doesn't understand how tariffs work. And I have been in the room where people in the first term did explain how it worked, that it's the American importer who pays the tariff and then the American consumer who probably bears most of the cost. He just won't take that point on board. He says repeatedly he's going to make the foreigners pay. So this is something he does believe in. He said it's the most beautiful word in the dictionary. And now we're launched, and on April 2nd, when Liberation Day comes, we'll be launched even further into an experiment that we haven't made since the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, right after the crash of 29, which many people believe just exacerbated the economic downturn into the Great Depression. We have no real contemporary experience with a trade war. But this time, unlike in his first term, the trading partners that were attacking most, two of our three biggest being Canada and Mexico, China being the other in the top three, and then Europe, they're going to retaliate this time. And my guess is it's a lot easier to get into a trade war than it is to get out of it. So that the economic harm that's going to be caused here is going to have significant consequences. I buy the economic analysis that says in a real trade war, everybody ends up worse off.
In theory, this is at least one issue where Congress could take the power back from Trump, the ability to tariff. They have shown the Republicans in the Senate and in the House an unwillingness so far to stand up to very much of anything Donald Trump has proposed. Do you think there is a point at which they might exercise their power to take back the power of putting tariffs on countries?
Well, it's going to be an interesting test. There's certainly, as you say, very little evidence that they're willing to do it. It may be in the wake of the Signal chat group debacle that more Republicans are willing to stand up. My sense is that a lot of Republicans, House and Senate, don't really agree with Trump on many of these things. But they're intimidated. They don't want to see a primary challenger. They don't want to speak up. They don't want to get slapped around. They don't want to be threatened by Elon Musk funding a primary opponent. So there's good news and bad news. It's not the case that intellectually Trump now dominates the Republican Party because there's no intellectual content to dominate. But the bad news is people are reluctant to face the potentially negative political consequences. I don't think that's going to last forever. And as I say, I do think there are some signs it's beginning to crack even now.
You mentioned the Signal chat group. I know you've talked about it elsewhere. So that's just one question for you on it. I mean, you've been in national security, classified information, dealing with that for probably almost on your entire career. How serious a breach was this? And how much of a threat was it that foreign adversaries could see in real time what these cabinet members were discussing?
Well, to me, I just can't even imagine opening a Signal chat group or a Telegram chat group or anything else. People say, but the communications are encrypted. Well, that's fine. We have the National Security Agency that has big computers chugging along trying to de-encrypt any system that we want to try and get into, and our adversaries do as well. What's troubling about the Signal chat group is that it doesn't look to me like it was the first time this group had engaged in it. And this one was bad because they were talking about a U.S. military operation before it was launched. So in real time, if anybody had broken into that and conveyed that information to the Houthis, it could have jeopardized American pilots. It could have diminished our success in the attack. And it's not an answer to say, well, the attack went off okay, no casualties. The damage that's done is that we have shown weakness in our operational security that our adversaries will try and exploit. And the unanswered question is, how many times was this done before? How much other information went through Signal? What did we build the world's most secure telecommunications capability for, if not to use it on sensitive matters? And once you're on, a secure telephone, a U.S. government secure telephone, you don't worry what the level of classification is you're discussing. You'd be talking about an article in the morning newspaper or top secret code word items, and you're secure. When you're on Signal, did no one in that conversation for days ever say, maybe we ought to get off this and get back on a classified system? I'm just without words to understand how that could have happened.
Do you get the sense they use this for ease of communication because the other system was too difficult? And if that is the answer, is it any different than emails like Hillary Clinton did with classified information?
The email keyboard before the classified computer in my office at the White House looked a lot like the keyboard before the unclassified computer. And in terms of phones, all you have to do is pick up the phone on your desk and press the button, in my case, that said Secretary of Defense, and it's a drop line to the office. None of the people on that group, with the exception of Steve Witkoff, whom I don't understand why he was on the group, is more than an arm's length away from secure communication at any time, in their offices, in their homes, in their transportation. To say it somehow was inconvenient to use the government classified system is another inexplicable point. We were discussing using military force against a group of terrorists in Yemen. Is something more important on your schedule that day?
But what do you think the reason is then if it wasn't ease? Do you think it was, maybe they're afraid of what they term the deep state listening into their I mean, what would be the other reason that they would use signal as opposed to what you said?
I can't understand it. I just can't understand it. It's just inconceivable to me that you would do this.
The El Salvador what do you make of the immigration issue, the illegal roundups of Venezuelans who wouldn't be accepted by their home country being sent to El Salvadorian prisons, and the claims that some of them are not violent gang members as were first originally said to be? To me, this should be a scandal if you're sending nonviolent people, even if they're illegal immigrants, to a dungeon in El Salvador. But what do you make of it?
Well, I think a lot of this is theater for political purposes for Trump's base. I mean, on the positive side, Trump has largely done what he said he would do in terms of closing the border in a relatively short time, because we learned in his first term that deterrence works. If you tell people in Central America, you can walk from Honduras across Mexico to the Rio Grande, you're not getting in, sensible people will say, well, I'm not going to pack my bags and walk across Mexico. Biden came in and said, okay, all those Trump policies are over. People said, pack your bags, and away they went. Now you're back to saying you're not going to get in, so they don't come. That's an achievement, and I think we should recognize that. Deportation of the illegals who are already here, I think, is also entirely legitimate. But why they have to try to rely on things like the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 when there are plenty of existing authorities, why it has to be rushed, why you need the photography, why Kristi Noem has to go to El Salvador and pose with prisoners. This is all performance art. And, we'll see how this works out in litigation, but that part of it's not serious. And I don't know what accounts for it, but I think it's destructive to our relations in Latin America, and other parts of it I don't understand. Why allow, or why now revoke the authority to stay in this country essentially of all Venezuelans and Cubans, which they've done. These are the people who really do need political asylum. If they're gang members, by all means, round them up. It seems to me it's not a burden, shouldn't be a burden to prove in any individual case the person is in fact a gang member, not just on the government's say so, but on the basis of evidence, presumably, that they have. Once you've got them in custody, they're not threatening innocent Americans anymore. I'd love to get them out of the country quickly, too, but an immigration judge hearing is not a heavy burden.
How likely is it, do you think, that Trump will authorize strikes to take out Iran's nuclear program?
Well, I don't know that he will authorize American military involvement, but I do think he should authorize the Israelis to do it. I would be stunned if the subject didn't come up when Prime Minister Netanyahu was here some weeks back. I think this is the most opportune moment Israel has ever had to destroy the nuclear program. I think they've got to take steps in advance to protect against retaliation by Hezbollah, which still has a large arsenal in Lebanon, and take steps against the Iranian ballistic missile program, which they've still got a good number of missiles in their arsenal. But this nuclear threat is not just a problem for Israel. It's not just Israel's responsibility. It's ours. It's the world. The proliferation of nuclear weapons is a global threat. I would be perfectly comfortable to strike militarily along with Israel. I'd be perfectly comfortable to give them intelligence and other support. If the nuclear program in Iran can be eliminated, the adding to the work that Israel's already done against Iran's terrorist proxies is a big step towards some kind of resolution of the regime of the Ayatollahs in Tehran. There's already a lot of finger pointing and recrimination over the damage that Israel has inflicted, the fall of the Assad regime,
I think,
and a strike on the nuclear program might be the tipping point that actually brings the regime down.
Does Israel have the capacity to take out Iran's nuclear program without the United States?
It's got the capacity pretty much to take out the most important parts of it. Some parts are beyond their capability, but they can destroy them for temporarily. That have to do preventive maintenance. That's one reason I would say the U.S. should join with Israel. Let us take care of the parts that we can do really permanent damage to. And people say, but this would risk a regional war in the Middle East. It absolutely would not if the Iranian retaliatory capacity were eliminated first. Most of the Arab states in the region would be quietly saying, thank God they've finally gotten around to doing it, because they see the threat to them, Gulf Arabs in particular, the same way Israel sees the threat of Iran's nuclear program and the threat of Iran's Ring of Fire strategy, which applies initially to Israel, but could be applied against the Gulf Arab states too.
Mr. Ambassador, my friend Jamie Kirchick, who was on the show recently wrote an op-ed in Politico about how he believes some of the events of the last several weeks with regards to Europe will end the American-led free world order. You said earlier that you think it's reversible, but my question to you is, it's easy to point out of things that we don't like that America has to do to uphold the liberal free world order. It's harder sometimes to see the benefits because they're more dispersed. What are the benefits that America has gotten since World War II of being the leading superpower by keeping the sea lanes open? What have been the benefits to America that sometimes it's not so easy to hold up that Americans might not understand?
Yeah. Well, let me say first, I think people on all sides of the political spectrum, liberal Democrats and some Republicans as well, make a mistake by effectively saying we're doing all this for the greater good of mankind, that we're just concerned about conditions all over the world and we're nice people and that's why we do all this. We are nice people and we do a lot for friends and allies who don't bear their fair share of the burden. That's clear, and we should work to make friends and allies bear their fair share of the burden. But here's the real point. We're not doing it for them. We're doing it for us. The provision of order that we've made in the world, we and our allies since 1945, is what has kept what peace there is, and it hasn't been perfect, has allowed the growth of economic interaction all over the world that's brought the greatest prosperity seen in history, including to us. Trade, travel, communications, the revolution is incredible. And it rests fundamentally since 1945 on American power. We're doing it because it's in our interest. If we didn't do it, one of two things would happen. One, there'd be spreading chaos around the world as the order collapsed. Or two, our adversaries would move in to take advantage of it. We're doing this because we're looking out for our interest. And nobody else is going to look out for our interest better than we are. If we don't do it, if we pull back, if we look at the Houthis blocking the Red Sea maritime passage, as J.D. Vance did, and say, that's just for the Europeans to take care of, that's a narrow, cramped vision of the world. It's been a principle. Freedom of the seas has been a principle of U.S. policy since before we were a country. And we do it around the world, not because of the specific dollars and cents value of trade in one particular geographic location, but because we insist on it on a worldwide basis. So I would say we need more argumentation by political leaders on why this world order we have created benefits us. I'm glad other people benefit from it too, because we are nice people and generous, but we're doing it because on balance, it benefits us more than anybody else.
I want to close, Mr. Ambassador, with the remaining minute or two we have left and just ask you, you for years were at the center of Republican politics, foreign policy, thinking, what is this kind of new role now that you're a little bit on the outside because of your relationship with Donald Trump been like for you? What is it like to be kind of on the periphery? Are you still able to advise senators or people even within the Trump administration, or do you feel exiled in some way?
Well, I do talk to plenty of people whose names I try and keep private so they don't incur the wrath of Trump. But look, when I began my political career, the first campaign I got involved in was Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign in 1964, which did not end well for Barry Goldwater. So you go through periods of success and periods of failure, and people should remember that 4 years after Goldwater went down to the worst defeat in history as of that time, Nixon was elected president, surprising everybody. He was then destroyed by the Watergate scandal, resigning in 1974. People said the Republican Party and conservatism were dead. And 6 years later, we elected Ronald Reagan. It comes and it goes, and you just have to accept that that's the nature of politics.
One of Trump's first actions was, as you've spoken out on television, about taking away your security detail. Are you concerned, as some, I think, other critics of Trump are, that he could go further and either use the IRS to audit you or come up with a reason to prosecute you? Do you think he might do that? Is he capable of doing something like that? And do you fear that?
Sure. Look, I think retribution is clearly part of Trump's game plan for the second term. Look at the law firms he's going after. And some of them have capitulated, which is a terrible signal for the rest of the legal profession. This is not why we elect people president, but like everything else about Trump, it's all about him personally. It's not about America. It's about Donald Trump. That's what the central problem is.
And finally, Mr. Ambassador, there are some who fear that Trump will try to run for another term, even though he's constitutionally ineligible. Do you think that our structure is strong enough to withstand whatever anti-democratic impulses that Donald Trump tries to impose during his second term in office?
Look, he will push against anything because he doesn't have any discipline. He doesn't want to be constrained by any rules. But I do think the Constitution and our civil society are strong enough to stand against that if that's what he tries to do. We've been through a lot of difficulties over 200 plus years. The framers of the Constitution knew they weren't writing for perfect people. They knew that there would be times of stress. We're in one of those now. But if we just remember what our ideals are, we will prevail over Trump because his only ideal is himself.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for joining the Dispatch podcast.
Glad to be with you.